I want to thank right away TDC for making the time to share their insights and learnings with all of us on the line. There eventually will be somewhere upwards of 100 people, maybe closer to 200. And so thank you, TDC. I think that shows just how much interest there is in the work that you're doing and what you're seeing. I also want to thank the Barr Foundation for supporting this program and making it possible to offer it to such a wide swath of nonprofits across the state. And Arts Boston, we really appreciate your partnership in spreading the word about today's presentation. So because we have so many people on the line, I would just really emphasize, please keep yourself on mute at all times, but we do invite you to keep your video on if that's an option for you. TDC is going to be running through a slide presentation, and we will certainly share the slide presentation with you afterwards in a follow-up email. So I just want to be really clear about that. We'll make sure you have that, as well as a recording. We're making a recording of this session, and we post that to YouTube, and we'll give you a link so you can access that. On today's call, I'm joined by a number of my Philanthropy Massachusetts colleagues, including Jeff Poulos, our CEO, and Kelton Artuso, who's our Programs and Services Manager. She runs our Nonprofit Partners Program. And as we continue to assess what fund development services, classes, workshops, and other technical assistance we could be offering to the nonprofit sector, moments like today are really important. We want to hear what folks are saying, what your reality is, and build that into our future programming to the extent that it's helpful to you. Some of you, I think, have participated in past programming of Philanthropy Massachusetts. Others have not, but all are welcome, and we're glad to have you today. And we hope you'll consider joining for future programs and sessions. So I just want to really briefly tell you what to expect from today, from our time together. We have an hour and a half. We'll try to use the time efficiently so that you get the most out of it. We know it's these days when most of us are still at home, the time can fly by weirdly. So we want to make sure this is useful to you. We're going to have a 40 to 45-minute presentation by TDC. Colleagues Susan Nelson and Bailey Hoare of TDC are both on the line, and they're going to do some tag teaming and run through their presentation. And then we should really have about 30 minutes for questions and discussion. And the way we want to handle that period of time is that you can chat your questions in through the chat box, if that's an option for you, and I think for most of you it will be. There's also a raise your hand feature, and my colleagues will be monitoring the chat to really make sure that we can verbalize and identify and flag your questions so that Susan and Bailey hear them and can respond to them. But with so many people on the line, unless you use the raise the hand feature, we really recommend using chat for questions. So thank you in advance for doing that. Today's topic, and I think why you've all come and what your lived reality is about the financial needs of arts and culture nonprofits in the context of COVID-19, both now, today, and moving forward. Together with the Mass Nonprofit Network, Philanthropy Massachusetts has been in touch with the sector since the start of the pandemic, trying to assess current context and respond to needs. We've also been running programming for funders across the state. And just a few weeks ago, TDC did a similar presentation to arts and culture funders from across the state, all types of funders. TDC's well-informed and honest presentation made an impact on those funders, and one of the first follow-ups they identified to us as a convener was to create an opportunity for TDC to do a similar presentation to nonprofit organizations. So I think we just want to recognize that nonprofit funders are really trying to hear what their community partners and grantees are experiencing and trying to be proactive in their response. So we very much appreciate TDC being available to share with us what they've been observing up close in the state, and I know they've been observing some things nationally too. We think a number of you already know TDC and would agree that they're a trusted voice and an ally to both the nonprofit sector and philanthropy. So we're really grateful that they were able to make the time to present today. So before I turn it over to Susan and Bailey of TDC, I just want to make sure, I want to check in with my colleague Kelton to know if anything's come in through the chat or if there's anything we need to respond to before turning it over to Susan and Bailey.
I think we're all set to get going.
Okay, thanks, Kelton. So Susan and Bailey, thanks for being with us, and I turn it over to you now.
All right, thank you so much. Can you everybody hear me? Yeah, great, excellent. So thank you for joining us today. It's really been a pleasure for us to work with folks at Philanthropy Mass to kind of think about how we can share what we've been learning with you. And so today, here's what we would like to talk to you about. We'd like to give you a little perspective about what we see as the current crisis and how it's framing our answers, struggles moving forward. We want to talk to you about how we think about planning and decision making in context of the crisis. We want to talk about it in a couple of different ways. We want to talk to you about how we see different phases of response and what kind of processes you might use in order to make some core decisions moving forward. And we want to talk to you about something very specific, a real way to kind of get into this issue and think about it, which is scenario planning. I know many of you are already trying to do this, and we're going to offer you a way or a thought about how to do that. And we want to talk about the hidden opportunity that we think there is in doing this kind of scenario planning, and then we want to open up the floor to you. So let's talk a little bit about the current crisis. You know, we all search for metaphors and analogies. I think that we all want to say what happened before, and can we learn from that, and can we kind of shape our lessons to that moment. And I think most of us go back to the Great Recession, but I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have already decided that the Great Recession is not a perfect analogy, and in fact it actually doesn't offer the lessons that we want it to. And that's for two really big reasons. One was the Great Recession was about short-term dip in demand around earned revenue. It wasn't about a sector-wide stoppage of demand where all earned revenue functionally has ceased, or in a meaningful way has ceased. And while the stock market kind of looked the same, and endowments for both foundations and individual organizations, as well as people's personal wealth, took a hit, it wasn't in the context of actual stoppage of demand. So what happened in the Great Recession is what we know in looking at the data, that while individual organizations might have struggled, philanthropy actually stepped up both on the individual basis and on the institutional basis, and covered the biggest holes that happened in 2009. Right now, because the sector-wide demand stoppage is such a hit on earned revenue throughout the entire sector, we really see that demand for philanthropic support could be much greater than the actual philanthropic support available. So we think of this as the context that we're walking into kind of this next 18 to 24 months. So observations from the field is something we also been thinking about. What has actually been happening in the field around the state and around the country? So what we really have come to understand is that returning to normal, as I'm sure all of you know, will be a longer and much slower process than what we had hoped. And we are actually thinking here about raising the dimmer rather than flipping the switch, that the public health guidelines are evolving in such a way that it's a slow return back, and it is not kind of just flipping the lights and coming back in. And that the most important factors that we are thinking about right now is audience, artist, and staff safety as an essential factor in this moment. And I think when we all started, we were really quite worried about audiences, but now we have moved to understand that it is everybody involved in our work whose safety is much in front of our minds, and we have to think about solving for all those pieces. And in the conversation about actually audiences, we think that we may not necessarily see a return to historical earned revenue. And there are two reasons for that. We think that audience demand will be linked to, but not fully dictated by public health guidelines. So folks may be cautious to come back, and may not come back in different subsectors due to their age or their health, or their actual just feelings about the virus itself. So that would affect audience demand, but we think the transition may accelerate current behavioral trends in audiences as well. And I'm sure everybody here on the phone has had different experiences with holding on to subscribers or members, and that how the behavioral trends in their audiences are changing now. And we think that this may accelerate some of those trends. So finally, what we've been seeing is both institutional and individual funders are confronting the same questions that arts and culture organizations are. How do we respond in this changing environment? And so often I know we look to our funding base to kind of give us tone and direction about where they're going, but at this moment, I would say that everybody's in the same boat trying to figure it all out at the same time, and that leaves us without clear direction or markers about how to respond. So what does that imply overall for the sector? We think the current unprecedented stress on the sector to provide cash is not a short-lived need. I know many of you might have applied for the payroll protection program and either got it or didn't, but for those who did get it, we've come to understand that that's very much a temporary solution and that it is not a solution that's going to go much past the end of June. And so while it's providing some cash into an extremely cash-strapped system, it's not even close to enough. So we think additional cash will be needed. After the PPP infusions are depleted and before programming relaunches and earned revenue relaunches in a real way, then another need for liquidity is going to be much on people's minds in many organizations. But then once you get through this phase, and we'll talk about the phases in a few minutes, you're going to need to relaunch and respond, and you're going to need cash. And you're going to need a chunk of cash to actually think about how to put yourself back into the community. And then over the long haul, we think you're going to need cash to actually reorient the overall environmental change. We think there's a lot of reasons to think there are things that around social distancing, gathering, the way we come together may have a long-term impact on our institutions. And so how do we respond and reorient in the long haul? And again, so this brings us back to this same issue that we think is real and we need to talk about, that it is likely that philanthropic demand cannot meet capacity for all the infusions of cash. And the philanthropic sector will be really challenged to fund in different ways than they do right now. So what does this mean for boards? I think one of the things that we have seen in a very encouraging light is that boards are really trying to step up in this moment and understand what is their critical role. And we believe the board's mission-focused, strategic, and fiduciary responsibilities remain critically important and actually become even more important in this moment. Does the board make sure you stay mission focused? How are you moving forward on strategy? And what is the fiduciary role of the institution? And how can the cash crisis that is about to come be managed through the board's involvement in both fundraising and planning? And so how do board members bring these responsibilities into planning and decision-making process? People should be thinking about how they are doing that. It says I'm muted, but okay, great. It said I was muted by the host. Okay, so let's talk about planning and decision-making for COVID. We think, and I'm sure you're experiencing this, there are three phases of response. Emergency, what we're in right now. Recovery, when the lights start to come up and the dimmer switch is slowly moved up, and then rebuilding and repositioning once we're through to the other side. The characteristics of each of these phases kind of look like this. Right now, and I'm sure this is all your lived experiences, you're making choices and cuts to stay alive. You have limited options for alternative programming, and many of them live in the digital space. And when does it last to? Until we have line of sight into initial relaxation of social distancing guidelines. Originally thought to be June for many people, but now it's likely to be a little bit longer. Recovery is when we can, again, start to bring up the lights, and what we see is designing and launching a broader array of alternative programming. It could be continued digital offerings. It could be in-person programs. And we'll talk more about this as we go through, or it could be deciding that actually in the recovery phase, there's not enough room and how to think about hibernating until you can reposition. And it lasts until we have full line of sight into full relaxation. And then in the rebuilding phase, it's making organizational program choices that we calibrate to what we're all cheerfully calling the new normal. Okay, so why do we care about these phases? I think why we care is that we believe that planning needs to be informed by awareness of all these phases. Planning looks ahead and informs current decision-making in the current phase. And let me give you the best example of that. In the emergency phase, it's often what we're trying to say is how much cash do we need to have to survive to the other side? And what we don't take into effect is, well, what happens when we get to the other side and need to employ more people, staff up again, start to do our productions, start to do our offerings and programmings? What is the cash leap at that moment? If in the emergency phase, you don't understand how much money you need to think about in the recovery phase and save for it, or plan for a way to get your hands on it, you won't be able to kind of restart the very work that you are really wanting to do. And so planning ahead and seeing what's happening ahead and understanding what you can best guess about each of these phases really informs what you need to do in the current phase. And we'll talk a lot more about that as we go through. Okay, there are two real key processes that we think about everybody having to use. And one is the one we're about to talk about in detail, and that's scenario planning. So when we talk about people trying to do one budget for the coming year, we all know that that is just not possible. There are too many things in play, and what we really need to do is create scenarios, multiple scenarios, to think about what could happen, and then how would that guide our work. And so for scenario planning, we're talking about it needs to be guided by a certain level of framework. And so we're proposing 3. The phases of the crisis response that we just talked to you about, emergency recovery and rebuilding, some grounding principles, why are you here, why does it matter, who are you trying to serve, and then some levers for planning that we'll walk you through. Once you have those frameworks in play, it helps you identify the budget, the operational and capital implications, i.e. the cash implications of what you need to kind of judge and think about, and then you test it through cash flow and a risk analysis lens. I am sure everybody on the phone today has now, if you haven't been doing cash flow before, you are doing cash flow now. And I'm here to tell you that cash flow is going to be your friend for the next 18 to 24 months. Understanding how to use cash flow is critical to the work, and really understanding when you run out of cash or when you could run out of cash is the most important thing that you will have to think about as you do all this scenario planning. And because budgeting is not what it was once, what we're encouraging people to do is actually do rolling quarterly projections based on your different informed scenarios as an alternative to a detailed annual budget, which we think just cannot be done. And these projections support ongoing decision-making in response to all the different changing contexts that we're seeing, but it helps us set real milestones and major moving pieces in the operating model. And again, we'll talk more about that as we go along. Okay, so I'm going to turn this over now to Bailey to talk to you about a little bit about how you would actually do scenario planning.
Great. Thanks, Susan. So as Susan mentioned, we think there are some key guiding frameworks that would inform your development of each scenario. So we want to introduce each of those, and then we'll talk you through actually how we think the scenario development process might work. So as Susan mentioned, we're thinking about 3 guiding frameworks. First, those phases of response and how emergency recovery and rebuilding might play over time. Second, the grounding principles around your mission and vision and the why you exist and what you want to preserve from a mission perspective through the crisis. And third, the factors that are going to have a major impact on planning. So to give you a little bit more context for what we mean by these guiding principles, we think arriving at shared agreement amongst board and staff about the core of the mission and vision of the organization that you want to preserve through the crisis is really important. So questions that people have been asking themselves as we talk about this with them are, what do I see as my responsibility to my communities, to the art forms that I support, and to the artists that I work with? Similarly, what is my responsibility to others in the ecosystem in which I sit, however I define that? What's my responsibility to the venues that I might work with or perform in, to the venues that I own and I offer to others in the ecosystem? What's my responsibility to the partners and collaborators whom I work with to deliver my mission and to deliver my services to the community? Lots of organizations have been thinking about their commitments to equity and justice and what that looks like in this time, acknowledging that the pandemic itself has had really disparate impacts both within and across communities. Organizations are really thinking about how their commitments to equity, cultural competency, inclusion, and accessibility are playing right now in this context. Lastly, we think it's worth reflecting on your current strategy. We do a lot of strategic business planning, and we've talked to a lot of folks about what they do with their strategic plan that they might have just finished or might have just been starting to launch. And so we think it's worth thinking about, are there pieces of your current strategy that feel really critical to keep pushing on in this time? We think there are 3 levers for planning that are really going to inform the moves you might make as an organization. The first are the public health conditions, those things that are being externally set right now. These both have an impact on the timeline, how we would move in between those phases of response when we move from emergency to recovery, but they're also going to establish key parameters for operations and programming. When might you be allowed back in the hall? How many people might be allowed back? How many people could sit in the classroom at a given time? Second, we think this idea of audience demand is really important. Public health conditions are going to set our sort of max, but the behavioral and attitudinal aspects of how our audiences and community members respond are also going to inform how the world looks in the next couple of years. Lastly, programming, which is the implication of the external conditions around public health and audience demand. We think that programming should respond to those two conditions through the lens of those guiding principles. So as you think about really the core of your mission that you want to deliver, what's the programming that you would offer? Let's talk a little bit about public health conditions. We'll talk about each of these. We think there are two key questions here. First, when and how will we be able to gather again? In other words, when can we press play on that recovery phase and start to raise that dimmer switch, as Susan mentioned? As we're seeing, this is differing from state to state and also city to city within Massachusetts. We think the second question is, how will those public health guidelines change over time? How are we going to move towards a full relaxation of those distancing restrictions? How fast are we lifting that dimmer switch? How fast are the lights coming on? And then there's also this question that's emerging that's much on the public health experts' mind about second wave of infection. So might we be taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back for the next little while as we understand how the virus progresses? Next, this idea of audience demand. So we think the attitudes of your audiences are going to play slightly differently over the next few months and years. First, as Susan mentioned, there is this comfort factor. Will audience members be comfortable attending events given the public health climate? Even if I can go sit in a theater 10 feet away from people, am I going to feel comfortable doing so? And how are your audience members, who may be, as many performing arts audiences are, particularly part of some at-risk populations, how are they going to feel comfortable going back out into public? As Susan mentioned, we're also experiencing extreme economic volatility right now. So how will the financial climate impact attitudes to discretionary spending? Will people feel comfortable putting their money out in the market? How will people feel about spending on tickets, on classes, on arts and culture consumption? We are really fascinated by this question of habit and whether audiences will return to old patterns of behavior if they're out of the habit. So if we're in a universe where your traditional season of programming looks nothing like it did last year and we take a year off, our audience is going to opt back into that pattern of behavior that they might have built with you before, or are we going to see something change? Lastly, we think there's a really important question about the competitive market, especially right now as lots of arts and culture organizations are trying new digital and virtual offerings. We have moved to an entirely new platform of delivery, and that has opened up some tremendous opportunities to reach broader audiences. It's also opened up a wider competitive market that you now find yourself in. So you are now competing for screen time, not just with other nonprofits in your area, but with a broader array of arts and culture nonprofits, and indeed with the culture ecosystem, all of those streaming services vying for screen time. So how are people seeing you in light of that competitive market and that shift? Audience demand is obviously going to change as we move through these phases as well. So what is your hypothesis about how demand might change, how people might start to feel more comfortable? Lastly, we think it's worth reflecting on what data could inform your understanding of demand over time. How are you starting to actually get out there and talk to audiences and understand where they might feel comfortable, under what conditions they might or may not return? How are you starting to test that out? So therefore, what does the intersection of public health and audience demand imply for the programming choices that you would make? We think for the next little while, especially in this emergency and the recovery phases, your programming is going to look pretty different than your usual artistic product. Folks have talked to us about the content being different. Putting a large chorus on stage, just saying a massive choral work, doesn't feel great right now, given all of the things we know about disease transmission. Your partners or collaborators might look different, the people that you use to deliver your programming. The format might look different, obviously, virtual versus in person. The location might also be different. Lots of people talking about outdoor venues, new spaces, reconfiguring their spaces to make things work. So those are our sort of guiding frameworks. That's the philosophical grounding for the scenario planning exercise. And we now want to walk you through the nitty-gritty of how it might work. So we have identified, we're consultants, we love a good flow chart. We've identified 4 steps. Set the parameters, identify the choices that you would make given those parameters, identify their implications, and then this really important step of assessing the risks. So when we say set the parameters, what we mean is use those frameworks that we just walked through to develop each scenario. So first, what's your phase timeline? When do you think in one scenario you might move from emergency response to recovery, and then from recovery into that rebuilding phase? What do you think public health conditions are going to look like in each of those phases? So when you say the recovery phase, do you imagine some sort of limited gathering? Do you imagine people gathering of up to 250 people? What might that look like? And then how might audience demand move in those contexts and shift over? So we've talked to lots of people about this and they say, okay, I get that. So how should I actually start picking the scenarios and actually setting those parameters across them? We think it's critically important. If we ask you to take one of like 5 things away from this presentation, this is number 1. Start with the worst case scenario. Starting with the worst case public health scenario that you can imagine, we think is really helpful. It highlights the implications of the fixed cost in your system. So if you are doing nothing and you are just trying to stay alive, what's the fixed cost burden that you have to carry and that you have to take care of? It's also going to clarify and put in really strong relief the cash you need to return to programming, as Susan mentioned. Once you start to run up again and start to put things back in the world, how much cash are you going to need? That's going to become really clear. And it's also going to provide a baseline sense of that overall capital need, so you can get your hands around how much total cash you're going to need across. We then think you can define other scenarios by working backwards quarterly. So this is just an example of how you might start to define your scenarios. We are not advocating for this top one as your worst case scenario. That is up to you. But in this case, the worst case scenario might be, we think we're going to stay in the emergency response phase until July of 2021. And only in next summer are we going to start to do some of that recovery programming, and we're going to feel comfortable having people in person again. Then you might work backwards quarterly to say, what if we could start having in-person programming in April of 2021 or January of 2021? So once you've set the parameters for each of your scenarios and you've got that going, we then think you have to think about the choices you make. So what programming would you offer, as we mentioned? And then there are other choices that you might need to make to respond to public health conditions and potential audience demand. Again, we're consultants and we love a good matrix. So here's what we got. You would set the parameters for each scenario really by sort of filling in each of these axes here. Those are your parameters. And then once you've got that, for public health, what would you do to ensure audience, artist, and staff safety? What changes might you need to make? How might your pricing structure or revenue model respond to audience demand? Do you feel that for the next little while, things need to be free or offered at a lower cost? If you're offering a digital program, does it need to be less expensive than your usual in-person program? Lastly, this question around programming, what would your alternative programming look like for the next little while? And is it worth it? We're going to talk about that in a second. These questions are worth reflecting on, certainly in this phase right now, in the emergency response phase. As we move into the recovery phase and we start thinking about in-person offerings, we also think they're worth reflecting on as you look forward to rebuilding and repositioning. Given the new normal, which nobody knows what it looks like, will you need a new pricing or revenue structure to respond to how the world has changed? Might your programming in the new normal actually look different than it did previously? So let's talk about this idea of alternative programming and whether it's worth it. We think a good old-fashioned cost-benefit analysis here is really critical. So understanding, given the programming that you might put out, what are the costs? There's going to be some one-time investment to develop and launch the programming because it's going to look different than it usually does. It's going to have some ongoing direct costs. It might well have implications for other efforts, for the kinds of staff you need, how they use their time, and then therefore what you can and can't do. And there's obviously an opportunity cost associated as well, if you're choosing to do one thing that might take your attention away from something else. On the other side of the scales, considering the benefits of the programming, both financial and non-monetary. So yes, we think it's important to say, do we expect that this will return us any earned revenue? Do we think we'll get any money back from this? But equally as important, what are you trying to achieve with this programming from an intangible benefit perspective? So what is the mission imperative that you might be fulfilling in putting forward this programming, and what's the benefit associated with that? Do you feel an obligation to your artists or to your communities? How do you feel about that? Are you doing something to maintain awareness or keep presence in the market for your audiences, for your supporters? Do you actually think that the benefit of running alternative programming right now is to test new ideas that might turn into programs for the future? So once you've identified the costs, and once you've gotten really clear about what you think the benefits of putting that program out in the world would be, you sit with the two of them and you think, do they balance? Do those costs merit the benefits that I think I'm going to achieve? In particular, people have been reflecting on this one variation of that question, which is this the experience that I want to offer my audiences and my artists? So as an example, if I'm a theater company and the kind of work that I think I can do to respond to the public health conditions is a whole series of one-man shows in a very small theater, how do I feel about that experience? And how does that artistic experience, the benefit of that artistic experience, weigh for me against the cost that it would take to put that on stage and how I feel about it from a mission perspective? So once you've sort of set your parameters, you've identified the choices, then you get to do the fun work of playing out the implications. So we think about this in a couple of ways. First, for your budget and operations, what are the financial implications? Those therefore have implications for capital need. Taken together, those will impact your cash flow. And then we also think it's worth reflecting on long-term strategy implications. How might this scenario impact your long-term trajectory? So for budget and operations, we mentioned the cost of assuring audience, artist, and staff safety, likely going to have some incremental expenses associated with it to make sure that everybody's safe. At the very least, hand sanitizer costs money. There's also likely going to be an earned revenue shift related to audience demand as you think about potential new pricing models, and we also think about actually realized attendance, how many people are showing up and participating in what you're offering. Programming will also have a corresponding expense shift. Alternative programming might have a different cost base, might be a little more, you might get some savings. There also might be an earned revenue shift associated with those alternative programs depending on the pricing model that you put in place. And then again, as you reflect over into that rebuilding and repositioning phase, it might be that more broadly you are looking at a new revenue model or a new programmatic or business model as you respond to the conditions. So those are against our sort of levers for planning. And taken together, there are two really important questions. First, what are the implications for contributed revenue? And second, this operational question of how skinny can you get? As we are in a world, as Susan mentioned, of limited cash and limited resources, we think it's really worth reflecting on how skinny can your organization get to deliver these things, to ensure safety, to make sure you're delivering on your mission, while keeping you really lean to get to the next phases and to get to the long term. So lots of people have asked us what the heck to do about projecting contributed revenue in this scenario planning exercise. We think it's really important to start from a deep understanding of your current and historical donor base. So we highly recommend, if you've got access to the data, going back and looking at 3 to 5 years of donor records and starting to think about your donors in groups, either by the size of their donation, you know, higher end major donors, mid-level donors, lower level donors, or by the closeness of their relationship with you. Other dimensions that you could pick in terms of grouping, but we think identifying some big groups of donors who have shared characteristics, and then thinking about how those groups define their relationship with you. We think the key question here is, to what extent is their support programmatically driven? Do you have donors who are really motivated by the work that you are putting out, the classes, the programs, the performances, or are they motivated to support the organization as a whole? That's going to determine possibly the way that they support you in the recovery phase when your programming might look different. We also think it's important to look at the historical behavior of that group, particularly the size of their gifts over time and the stickiness of that group, their retention, their loyalty to you. Depending on how they have behaved in the past, that will give you a helpful indication of how you might think they behave in the future. So the next piece is identifying implications for capital need. As Susan mentioned, we think there's going to be cash need in each of these phases as we move. In the emergency response phase, we really think the need right now is for working capital, for day-to-day needs. It can be sized to your skinny down operational footprint. And it should also take into account new monthly expenses due to any safety measures that you're putting in place and digital programming if you're running it. In the recovery phase, your working capital need is going to change. If you are running programming, it's going to size to an adjusted, slightly larger operational footprint and any new monthly expenses associated. In the recovery phase, we also think there's a really important moment for change capital here. Setting the safety measures up that are needed to welcome audiences and artists back into any public space is going to cost money. We also think there will be testing and startup costs for new programming because it's going to look different than it. In the rebuilding and repositioning phase, again, your working capital need will shift. It will be sized to the new operating footprint of the organization, whether that looks like back where you were before or something entirely different. We also think several organizations will need some recovery capital in terms of a one-time liquidity reset to get you back to neutral to really build you a strong foundation for rebuilding from a balance sheet perspective. We also think change capital is going to be really important here for testing and startup for new programmatic models and possibly some change capital to help you reposition in the market once we emerge from the crisis. How can you use your own capital to support those capital needs versus raising, and what's the balance? We think thinking about the following questions are really helpful. First, if you've got board designated reserves and you are fortunate enough to have those sitting on your balance sheet, how can those support working capital? We think it's really important in this moment that organizations have at least 1 month of unrestricted operating cash, and that 1 month should be sized to your future need, not your current lean fighting weight. That unrestricted operating cash, that month worth of cash in the system, provides you critical flex as things change over time, and really we think that's the floor. So to the extent that your board designated reserves can provide that working capital, that's really great. One very important thing, at this moment, including deferred revenue in your working capital calculation feels like a big risk, given that deferred revenue is a promise for services to be delivered, and we're not sure if those services can be delivered right now. So we highly recommend that as you look at your working capital and you look at your unrestricted cash, you take deferred revenue out of that calculation. We also think that it's worth considering whether you have capital on your balance sheet, unrestricted capital, that could help you self-fund change capital. In particular, if you have investment funds, we think it's worth talking about the benefits and risks of increasing your investment draw to the prudent management limit, not beyond, and seeing whether that could add some additional capital in the system that could help you do a little bit of that testing or setup capital, so funding change capital for yourself. The one place where we think people have to be really careful with their own capital is around facilities reserves and changing the purpose of the facility reserve to support working capital. If you are an organization that has a facility and that facility is core to the mission and vision that you're trying to preserve, if that facility is really a huge part of your mission delivery, and you are fortunate enough to have raised money for that facility reserve, we think it's really important to preserve those funds. The facility needs, the deferred maintenance needs, the capital needs are not going to change whether you're putting programming in that venue or not. And that capital is often hard to raise, so we would encourage you to really keep that facility reserve if you've got it and the facility is yours to maintain and preserve. We also think it's worth thinking really carefully about appropriate uses of debt in the current moment. So here are the ones that we think are worthwhile right now. Everything else feels risky. So first, if you have access to long-term debt with low rates of repayment, the Economic Disaster Impact Loan is one of the few programs out there right now that offers long-term time horizon, low rates of repayment. That feels like a fairly safe bet over time right now. Second, we think using a line of credit that can truly serve as cash flow support is an appropriate thing to consider. Truly supporting cash flow means you have a way to pay it back within a couple of months or at the very latest within a year. If you are thinking about drawing on a line of credit but you have no line of sight into how you would pay it back, that runs the risk of turning into permanent financing, which is not setting you up well for that rebuilding and repositioning phase. Lastly, if you are in a capital campaign and you have been considering campaign financing, we think campaign financing is appropriate only for the amount of pledges that you have received to date. So if you are considering that financing model, we would not encourage you, we would encourage you to think hard, put it in the positive, we encourage you to think hard about the amount of campaign financing that you would take out and only balancing it to the amount of pledges that you've received, not the total amount of your projected campaign. So your budget and operational implications and your capital needs together will have implications for how your cash flow works. So in the emergency response phase, your cash flow is going to be determined by any drop in anticipated earned revenue, contributed revenue that might be coming in the system, and your new fixed cost model. In the recovery phase, again, the balance between your earned and contributed revenue and how that's shifting in the current moment and your fixed costs, as well as the scale and timing of those one-time costs, those change capital needs that we identify. In the rebuilding and repositioning phase, again, there is the monthly movement of your new revenue and expense structure, and again, the scale and timing of one-time costs, those one-time investments in new programs, in safety measures, in repositioning. There are also implications from a timing perspective for those that you need to consider. So the last implication that we think is worth reflecting on is your long-term strategy. So given the current climate and the scenarios you've developed, what part of your long-term strategy remains relevant and what part of it might need to be put on pause or thrown in the recycling bin, as it were? We think for most people, the core values of a strategic plan are likely to hold, but the strategies and tactics of that plan might need to shift. And it might be that you get into the recovery phase and you reconsider the strategies and tactics that you might use to achieve your goals. Similarly, we think that capital expansions or capital campaigns or facility expansions might successfully continue if they respond to current needs, if they feel like they're in line with what we're experiencing right now. The other critical factor is whether the economic climate can support. So the last piece in this scenario planning process is looking at the risks. What are the potential risks associated with each scenario, and are these potential risks tolerable? And as Susan will talk about, we think that this is really a joint enterprise between staff and board members really have to hold this question about, are those risks tolerable? And if they're not, we think you have to go back and rework the scenario so that you arrive at a set of risks that feels okay. So when we think about the risks, we think about the following potential dimensions. What if the scenario costs more than you think? If you're thinking about programming costs exceeding what you think, does that change your cost benefit analysis of whether it's worth it? What if you've overestimated audience demand? What impact might that have on the scenario? What if the timing of the scenario is off? What if we're in the recovery phase for a longer time than you thought? What if the recovery phase is shorter than you thought? Taken together, how might that shift the scale of the capital that you need? And what impact might that have for your ability to deploy your own capital to support the scenario versus going out to raise? Once you've arrived at a set of risks that you can size and they feel tolerable, we think it's worth thinking about how you might respond to those risks in real time as the scenarios unfold. And then lastly, how you are communicating these risks and really building shared understanding of these risks among board and staff and other stakeholders as well, so everybody understands the risks that you're thinking about. So if we put it all together, this is our takeaway slide for you. The matrix of scenario planning, we're thinking about the dimensions, the parameters of each scenario set by the frameworks, the choices that you would make to respond to the conditions and their budgetary and operational implications, this question about the potential programming being whether it's worth it or not to you. Then as you look across each phase, what are the capital and cash flow implications? As we start to get further down the line, what does this imply for your long-term strategy? And then as we look at this whole scenario, what is the suite of risks that this implies, and do those feel tolerable to you? I'm going to pass it back to Susan to talk about who does what. Susan, I think you're muted.
Great. I think I'm unmuted now. So I think what we thought a lot about who knows what and how we would think about all the different roles. And I want to start this section by saying, if this is not a time for transparency, I don't know what the time is. This is the moment where we all have to be incredibly transparent with each other. So we think scenario planning should be a joint enterprise between staff and board leaders, and board members should be thinking about setting the parameters, especially around principles. How, what is it that, why are we here and why does it matter? But staff should drive the development of scenarios, and really they know the business, they understand what's happening, they understand the ins and outs. It's hard for board members to actually develop the scenarios. They're much more there to stress test them. Assessing and monitoring risk is a critical responsibility of the board. If this is not about risk management, again, now I'm not sure about when it is. And so understanding all the risks involved at the board level and having staff leadership be very transparent with the board about risk, I think again is critically important. Assuring the long-term fidelity to the mission is also the board's responsibility. Staff can articulate and share some of the really difficult choices ahead, but the board in the end needs to decide. And the results of scenario planning should inform ongoing, really transparent conversations with funders and supporters as well as boards. Again, I think this is a new normal. This is a new unnormal. This is not a moment where regular communications are going to work. Bailey and I have done this presentation many times, and at one point somebody asked me the question, so I want to do rolling quarterly projections, but I can't give that to funders because they need a yearly budget. So now is the moment to tell a funder, I can't give you a yearly budget and here's why. And actually not try to conform to the system, but open up in the most direct way and explain your needs to the people who are trying to fund and support you. Understanding what choices you've made and why and what your critical needs are is a really important moment in time. Otherwise, people cannot fund you in the way that actually will help you move ahead. So we want to talk a little bit about what we're calling the hidden phase of this process. There is this moment where, as we're moving through emergency recovery and rebuilding, that perhaps we could reimagine. What do we mean by reimagining? Over the last decade or more, the sector has been really talking about reimagining, and there are things that we all reflect on constantly that are upsetting to us and frustrating to us as both an individual organization as a sector. We worry that our audiences don't reflect the communities we wish to serve. For some, the role of Eurocentric art continues to be prevalent, and that's a conversation they would like to change and open up. Partnerships and collaborations are often highly transactional and don't think about the ecosystem as a whole and how we all work together, which has many of you experiencing at this moment some of the conflicts about how to resolve some of the work that we're trying to do together. And business models, again, this is something we've talked to a lot of you about for many years, don't adequately support or sustain our mission delivery. One of the reasons cash is going to be so tough coming at this moment is there is no cash in the system, and we have not created systems where the revenue models actually work. So these all are things that have been in play, and yet we have not been able to really resolve a lot of them. And we think there are systemic barriers that are hamstringing us all and really stopping us from doing this. And there's things like the prevalence of common practices and groupthink. Well, we all do it this way, or we all think it's this way to do it. So then rather than throwing out what we call best practices, which I like to call common practices, because I don't say anything truly best about them, makes people act in a certain way and not question whether or not they should do it that way. If all theaters do it that way, if all museums do it that way, isn't that right? Then the lack of available capital, as we've just said, the business models don't actually do that. We don't have cash to try new things, to push on all these issues that matter to us. We haven't been able to really kind of push through new thinking. And that leads to another piece, that we just don't have the capacity. We're so busy delivering what we currently have, we don't have the moment to really rethink. I had an amazing conversation with an organization last week who is going to hibernate for the year, and had this moment that dawned on them that their music education programs were not what they wanted them to be. They were good, they were fine, teachers liked them, kids liked them, but when they really looked at what they were trying to accomplish, they weren't sufficient. And so they're going to take this moment, step all the way back, and redo them all. which is a moment to say, what is it that we're really trying to educate kids about, and what are the outcomes we want for them, and how would we do it? And what kind of capital would we really need, and can we go ahead and raise it? It's a really energizing moment for folks, and to think about what is getting in our way. So can we use this moment as an opportunity to start kind of finally step back after a decade of wrestling and think about these things in different ways? So what would that look like? It would mean, how do you really think about building relevance to a broader, more diverse community? Rather than have it be a special project that you work on, how is it core to what you are actually doing? What does it mean to create stronger connections with communities? At this moment where we believe art is key to our healing and change coming back from this virus, what does that really mean to have a strong connection with our community? What would it mean to have that be core to who we are? What is our truly equitable relationship with artists and creatives? If anything's highlighted the problems of sweat equity and the investment in our artists and creatives, it's been this moment where people are truly going without. What does it really mean to be an equitable set of relationships? And then forging new kinds of partnerships and collaborations, ones that actually advance the ecosystem rather than are fully transactional. And if we're going to be honest and direct with supporters and funders now about why we need what we need and why we made the choices, why can't that be an ongoing practice where we're actually communicating on a level of parity and equality rather than on a moment of a power dynamic? And then, can we reflect on new modes of mission delivery? We've been talking to a lot of folks about it's the mission, not the model. How do we actually think about what it is that's core to us that really matters, rather than how we've been doing it? Is there a way to step back and think about that? Again, we've been working with different organizations who actually found an epiphany in their digital moment, where they actually had been anti-digital for lots of very good reasons around their connections to both artists and individuals. But for their particular relationship, it turns out that the digital moment actually caused them to be able to reach out in a much more meaningful way to different people, and it's challenged their very mode of mission delivery in a positive, thoughtful way. So if you were to kind of work on these issues, what would you need to know and think about? Well, you'd need to think about what is standing in your way around your organizational culture or structure. Is there something happening about your own organization that's not allowing you to do this work? Then how would you think about differentiating yourself in the market? What is it that you're talking about doing? How would that work? How would you monetize those things? What is the model and structure that might work? And how much money would you need to invest to get going and started? In other words, how much change capital would you need? Not to just flip the light switch back on to go back where you are, which is going to be a lot of capital anyway, but could you best spend that capital in a different way to actually change your model and think differently? So there is the end of our conversation, and we'd be delighted to answer any questions or hear from you.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks, Bailey. And I appreciate that, like, in your presentation of the information, you kind of modeled transparency and asking hard questions. And I found this energizing. So thank you very much. And there are a number of questions that have come in. I'm going to use facilitator prerogative and put one out of my own first, and then Kelvin will let us know what people are asking. So I know you work with different sectors in the state and also nationally, and I don't know if either of you are in a position to comment on how the experience of COVID-19's impact is different for the arts and culture nonprofit sector versus other parts of the nonprofit sector.
You know, I think the loss of total demand is very equivalent actually to like the restaurant industry. So I don't want to pull out arts and culture to make it differently than that. What I will say is the prevalence of gig economy and sweat equity in our system is so rampant that it's really exposed a lot of the flaws in our system about how people get paid, how people support themselves, how they actually do work. For example, a lot of the reform around gig economy unemployment actually doesn't work right, because if you have W-2 income from one place and 1099 income from another place, you can only get unemployment around your W-2 income. So again, it's just exposed all the problems that I think the system has got underneath it in ways that are pretty stark.
Thanks. Kelton, I want to call on you at this point to identify some of the questions or themes that have come through the chat.
Sure, happy to do so. We have a question about a new earned revenue model. Have you experienced or seen models that organizations have started to test in terms of fee for online programming?
Mm-hmm. So I think we've seen two different tracks, and I'm going to generalize for a moment, but people who are offering classes and different type of classes have actually seen or lectures for fees have seen somewhat of a smoother ride into digital. There's the idea is the pricing right, and the big conversation is, do you want to drop the price, or do you want to declare that this has real value and therefore the price is the price, and it's just as good digitally as it is in person. So we've seen people really experimenting with that and moving those pieces off when appropriate, and when the forum kind of moves itself to actually having some level of success. And in fact, we've seen a few people have no bump at all if that's their core income. The other piece though is much harder. So if you're trying to digitize performance, or if you're trying to digitize art experience, the idea of going up with a paywall is much on people's minds. And so we have been seeing people thinking about what constitutes a paywall, and why do we want the paywall, and who is it for? So the really interesting conversation there is, and I'll give you an orchestral example just to give you an example, is if I am a smaller regional orchestra and what I'm trying to do behind my paywall is provide the experience of my musicians who my audience knows and loves, and it's very personal, what personal thing can I provide behind the paywall that might equal my subscription base or some form of my subscription fee in order to keep that local community involved, see some product, and actually have some earned revenue. So can I test a paywall that's in the line of membership or subscription to see if actually there is some meaning there? What is the content I need besides performance in order to do that? So that feels like a real discussion around earned revenue models. They're very tricky. What I would say is immediately people, especially boards, want to jump to, well, then we can be free to, we can attract an audience internationally. And all I will say back to you is, if I'm the regional orchestra X and I'm going up against the New York Phil and the Berlin Philharmonic, I'm not sure that you're going to get people behind a paywall to come and pay the same amount of money as the subscribers who know and love your musicians. So I think we have to temper our ambitions around what it is we're trying to do around that digital wall. We have seen people try to think about what social distancing performances or emissions might look like. And I think there it has become very evident that the proportionality between expense and revenue is really out of whack, and that testing for that is really important in your own individual organization. So if you can normally get 250 people in a hall and then you can only get 75, and the performance fee is the performance fee and the production fee is the production fee, the likelihood of you is pretty high. So this idea of how to do it in a socially distanced way around getting a net that is helpful is really challenging and requires a lot of analysis. And that is true for both programming at the kind of the museum side as well as performance side. What is it that actually is going to pay off here under socially distanced rules is tough. So that's a bunch of different examples, but this is, the earned revenue model is much on everyone's mind right now.
Great, thank you. And we have a question specific to small organizations with a budget around about $50,000 a year that traditionally rely upon project-based funding from grant-making organizations.
Yeah.
Do you have any recommendations for seeking unrestricted operating funds to ensure flexibility during recovery?
I think that's a great question. I think we are, if the world were perfect, we would say all money should be unrestricted. And we would encourage people to think that way. And I think this is what we mean by transparency with your funders. Programmatic funding in the next 18 months is going to be very difficult to use or sustain. So if funders care about organizations living, unrestricted dollars are going to be where it's going to be. So we believe that you should start talking to your funders about that now and getting people to understand that program, if you want people to be still here on the other side, even if you hibernate, it's going to cost you some money to hibernate. So how does annual operating support, or what we're trying to call unrestricted support help you move forward? So that's a great question, and that is a conversation you should start to have with your funders.
Great. And we do actually have another question about communicating with funders in an effective way.
Mm-hmm.
How do you manage the rolling quarterly budgets when your support is concentrated in one quarter? For example, November and December, you typically get about 70% of your annual funds.
Yeah. So I think that's how that's when we say you have to think about the worst scenario and put it out for as long as you want. What we're seeing is, like, how would you put that worst case scenario out? And let's say it would be next June. So then you start to roll back and look at what would happen. And so what you would do in the November, December quarter, where you see all your income, is you would make a judgment there about whether or not you doing kind of the contributed revenue things that we talked about. Would you get the money then? Do you think it is because you're so reliant at end of year fundraising and you're doing your rolling quarterly, would you see the money then? And if not, how would that affect the roll forward? So it's not like you're not looking at the panoply, but you're rolling your projections quarterly to understand where you're going to go. And we would be happy to kind of post up an example with this after this to show you how it would be done. We were happy to do that for you.
Great. Let's see. What do you see as key elements to be able to make a successful case for safe harbor funding for the sector from the state and also the city of Boston? Are there examples you are seeing from other cities or states that can serve as an example or inspiration?
So talk a little bit about what you mean by safe harbor funding.
That's me, Susan. It's Catherine Peters.
Hi, Catherine.
Hello. Let me get my video on so you can see me. By that, I mean, from the time that folks' PPP money runs out, end of June, mid-July, to the beginning of January or April or ... There's a big honking gap there. You've just told us that that the philanthropic community does not have the capacity to step up and fill this need. Rather than sit and moan about that, what can we be doing to follow some lead to both make the case about dedicated revenue for the arts and cultural community that is specifically designated for us, or making sure that we can be a part of what is already there in the city infrastructure? Who the heck is doing this better than we are? Because we're not doing it well.
No, we're not. So I would say, I would encourage, if any of you want to go onto a website and see what a really great advocacy agenda is, I would direct you to the League of American Orchestras website, who has gathered together all of the advocacy work happening on the federal level for all the different pieces that you're talking about, Catherine. So where is all the different pieces of legislation in play, and where is it that we need as nonprofit? And they have really pushed. And it's a great advocacy agenda. So they've identified all the current pots of money that need to be extended, new pots of money that should be changed, everything from, how do we fix the rest of this unemployment mess for people who are self-insured, to how do we actually fix the unemployment for gig workers to smooth this out, this 1099 W-2 program, to how do we actually think about another round of PPP and EDIL. I saw there was a question about that. There's really a move to make that much more open to people. So I would encourage folks to go look at that and kind of figure out where you want to play and the state of play. And I look at a lot of those things and they say they need to be replicated at the state level. They just need to be replicated at the state level. So wherever there's mirrored dollars, we need to think about how to do that. And right now, we are kind of to your point, we're kind of an afterthought. There are people pushing, and the advocacy at the national level is pretty directed, but it's not being pushed at the local level in the same way. So I agree that there's a ton of advocacy work we could do. There's also some initial work about what would a new WPA program look like in our current environment, and is that something that we want to advocate for, and what would it look like? And there are some initial pieces of legislation that have been again put in play at the federal level that we could look at and think about how do we push at the local level as well. So
Susan, thank you. Just a quick follow-up for everybody online. Heather, our colleague at the League of American Orchestras, who does the advocacy work for them, is an absolute superstar. And absolutely wonderful. And she does it not only for the League, but she shares her expertise and knowledge with the other national arts service organizations, such as Dance USA, Theater Communications Group, Chorus America, etc. So there is a long effect of that. It's a great model for us to think about, and we absolutely need to make sure that we are being more aggressive, assertive, and working together as a community going forward. Susan, if you come up with any other city or state folks for us to have a look at, send them our way, because we're on this.
Can I just jump in here? Jeff Poulos here with Philanthropy Massachusetts, and Catherine, such a great point that you're raising, and Susan, really thoughtful response. I want to bring it to the city and state level and remind people that your State Arts Advocacy Association of Mass Creative is an essential ally and leader for you at this time, and the Massachusetts Nonprofit Network, and for everyone on this call to make a link to those two organizations to ensure that you are staying part of the conversation and helping them make the case. They can't do it alone. You need to be part of that, actively making the case. And I think you have a unique case to make, in part because, as Susan and Bailey presented on this presentation, the loss of earned revenue down to zero, unlike most of the other sectors, there is an opportunity for them to gain some revenue or perhaps get introduced back into their lines of business much earlier than those who cannot gather and who cannot have audiences and cannot have more than 10, 25, whatever percent is going to be allowed to be in occupancy. So the arts and creativity sector has a case to make for what Catherine is speaking about, which is some sort of local and state support in addition to federal support.
Thanks, Jeff. Kelton, can I jump into, there's a question I saw that maybe I can address briefly.
Sure.
Someone asked, had heard that I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, Susan and Bailey did a similar presentation to arts funders, and they said, oh, someone asked, can we know who, which funders were on the line? What I can say is, we are at Philanthropy Massachusetts in conversation with funders across the state regularly, all types of funders, community foundations, family foundations, private foundations, public agencies, and we've just been struck really by the thoughtfulness of funders in wanting to talk to their grantees, be in touch, and think about the now and think about the future. So I'd say that's the general sense that we're getting from funders that we're talking to. And if you go to our website, which I'll put in the chat in a minute, we've collected resources, both available at the state level for certain parts of the state, some national funds, that if you haven't seen already could be useful as an example of what funders are trying to step up and do, and both financially and in non-financial ways as well.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah. Pivoting a little bit, we have a question around your thoughts on the possibilities of mergers and alliances as strategic options right now.
So I think that's a great question. So, we don't address that in this because this is about organizations and helping organizations think through what they need to make decisions on. There may be a moment when people do scenario plannings when, I say this about market testing and scenario planning all the time. Sometimes when you pray, God says no, and that's what this process is. And sometimes it's not going to work in somebody's favor. I think mergers and acquisitions is a twofold issue. One is an ecosystem issue. I mean, I think as a system, we have to think long and hard about what we need to preserve in this system and what needs to happen to make all the different things that make our ecosystem a great arts and cultural ecosystem. So what needs to be preserved? And how would we go about that through mergers and acquisitions? I think that's a big ecosystem question. I think on a personal level, what we know about mergers and acquisitions, which we do a lot of, is they're hard. And they're really hard when both sides are weak and there's not enough cash on the table. And putting two organizations together who are very weak is not going to create a strong organization. We also know that organizations don't merge well if their values and principles and core offerings do not match. And you can do all the surgery you want, and if that doesn't match, the heart is going to get rejected. So I think you have to think long and hard about that. All that being said, I do think there will be opportunities for people to make their own conclusions after they do scenario planning about whether or not they can make it. The flip side of that, though, is I think funders and larger organizations who have capacity, it is incumbent on them to look out into the world and the ecosystem and say, where are there things that we really need to preserve and how can we help do that if we have mission alignment or we have value alignment? So that's a long, complicated answer, but I think it's a pretty complicated question.
Thank you. And we had a question from Ron. And Ron, I'm wondering if you would be up for unmuting yourself and verbalizing your questions. I'm a little unclear on what you're talking about.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, thanks, Ron.
Oh, cool. I just actually answered. I didn't see your request for clarity until 2 minutes ago. But basically, I mean, I appreciate the scenarios that were laid out, every one of them, first step one, then step two, and then step three. But my experience, and maybe I've run afoul too many times of too many things, is that step one involves tripping, step two involves a broken leg, etc. In other words, what goes wrong? What has gone wrong? And so what are the lessons to be learned from that, that anybody listening on this or watching this can take away with him or her? I just think that grounding this in some real experience, some real specific experience is absolutely critical. Otherwise, it's just way too general and nice to hear and all that other good stuff.
So I would say that that's why we say to people, you have to start with the worst case scenario. If you don't confront the worst thing that you think can happen, which for some people may be no programming until next year, then you can't actually make core decisions. And what we know about people who've been doing this work and actually have a chance to understand what is the capital they need, what is the programming decisions they need to make, how are they going to work with their artists and help preserve those artists' lives or livelihood, and what are they going to do in this moment? You need to confront the worst scenario you can think of, and actually say, what does that mean, and what would be the decisions I would make once that happens? So we've been working with folks right now who have been doing that horrible, hard work, because it then gets you to confront flat out, how much cash do you have? Who are you going to invest that cash in? How are you going to invest it? And if you need more, what is the case you need to make in order to make that happen? And how strong is that case given the competing needs of the philanthropic market and the ecosystem that you're standing in? So we have seen people say, we're not going to have a season. We are going to stop all our programming. We're going to have to refund half of our money. We're going to put a digital presence up, but it's not going to be for money. It's going to be for awareness and conversation. So based on all those things, then what decisions would you need to make in order to survive to next year? Once you confront that, then you can start to back up and say, well, what if it happens a quarter earlier or a quarter earlier than that? And then what would that mean for the kind of programming that you want to do? The flip of that is, I will say, is that, as I said, people are actually trying to think about what is alternative programming that might work. And what we know isn't working right now in scenario is scooch your season to the right and hope for the best. That isn't working. And we don't see how it's going to work. So actually thinking that you're going to hold on to all your programming for next year in scenario planning, maybe a scenario you want to put in there as a backstop, but it is not a real scenario. So you need to kind of think about what is the real programming, and do we have opportunities to actually do something? We have seen smart organizations who actually learned something because they decided just to throw out, think that, well, we can't do anything, what could we do? And came up with something that was different for their folks. What I worry about, Ron, is sometimes when we put very specific examples out for people, this is what I call the common practices trap. People run and say, I'm going to do that too because another theater did that. And I got to tell you, we know that's the way to failure. That's how we've ended up in this situation today, right? Everybody wants to copy what everybody else did rather than look at what are my assets, what are my potential, who are my audience, what is my individual mission. So I think embracing the worst case, getting down in the dirt with it, moving backwards from the worst case, and thinking about what does that mean, and then opening up to say, are there opportunities to do truly different kinds of programming for individual people? And I'll give you the example I gave earlier about the group who kind of were able to say, oh, actually digital programming is for us, because it's actually what we are serving people who are actually isolated and lonely, and we didn't realize that we weren't getting to them with our personal model. Now that we've opened it up, that's great. They can't do earned revenue on this, but what they've learned already is it's a really compelling message that they can raise money off of that they couldn't raise before. So again, those are the kind of things we want people to kind of struggle with. I hope that helps.
Thanks. Another question for you. Have you seen or heard of any nonprofits having success filing insurance claims for lost performance income?
No. There is again legislation, right? There is a state senator here in Massachusetts who filed legislation about business interruption insurance and making insurance companies conform. That's happening all around the country. If that's something people want to advocate for, there is legislation filed. But right now, I think we know one group who, for reasons that we don't understand, had actual pandemic insurance. And for around a festival, and they just made out like you wouldn't believe. But everybody else, business interruption insurance, unless we've seen nobody have any luck at all. I'm sure I've seen people nodding at this moment too. So there is a bill filed.
Great. And thinking back on something you mentioned during the presentation, you recommended 1 month of unrestricted operating cash. How did you come to that 1 month figure?
Well, most people don't have it. So we started with what could we do here? So 1 month of operating cash means that at any given moment, can you see a month ahead and pay all your bills? And it should be sized to with the size you want to be, not the size that you are right now. So you can't try to grow your working capital 5 minutes before you reopen and get bigger again. That's not going to work. So you're going to have to think, how much is the working capital I need for 1 month baseline? That is the floor. Let's be clear what we're trying to say here. That's the minimum. That's the minimum. And so since a lot of people, and a lot of ways people get to that number is they use next year's subscription money, or they use other cash in hand, you can't do that. You got to think about the cash that I have right now, minimum of a month of the largest size I want to be when I come back. Otherwise, we can't even imagine. But you got to remember, you got to hold on to that month all the time. You can't consume it, and you got to keep replacing it. So it seems like an easy target, but you got to keep replacing, because you're going to spend it, then you're going to need it again. You're going to spend it, you're going to need it again. So you're going to kind of have to. That's why I know people thought, oh, can I do cash flow just to get through June 30th? No, you have to do cash flow from now until the second coming, because it's going to take you forever. You're going to have to keep looking at your cash flow and make sure you always have that month ahead of
you. Great. So I'm noticing we have like 10 minutes left. So if there are any remaining questions that you're holding on to, now is the time to add them to the chat or raise your hand. But I'm actually going to return to something that you mentioned earlier, which is PPP and EDIL funds. There have been some conversations in the chat about both, and so I'm wondering if you have any current info on those things that you think would be pertinent to participants.
No, as I said, the EDIL, there's a lot of push for it to reopen with nonprofits and in mind, and to not have all the kind of current mess around the PPPs. So again, that's pretty active legislation that's happening at the federal level. That's a pretty active push. Anything you guys can think about doing to join your voice, that's a pretty active push. The PPP, you know, God bless everybody. Everybody's going to have to keep following along. The $2 million, less than $2 million safe harbor for did you need it was the best question I saw answered, because that's if you got less than $2 million, the safe harbor around did you need it is now kind of been put to bed. Is it forgivable? I don't know about all of you. I filled out my form to see if I could make it work. It's filling out the form is pretty straightforward. I'm sure you all tried, even though it's 18 pages of instructions. There's so much still that is loosey-goosey about it that we know that up until the day the forgiveness is, it's going to change. So that's just keep watching. That's what I can say. Keep watching.
Let's see. What is the best way to approach new funding sources, foundations in particular at this time, as opposed to sources with whom you have an existing relationship?
I'll give you my opinion, then I can send it back, back to the host. But what we've been hearing from folks is that funders, by and large, no one can generalize, are sticking with their current investments about who and making sure that the people they are investing in currently are much on their minds. How that plays out against, I also know there is an agenda being discussed about how equitable investments are in communities, and how you can actually think how funders are going to have to think differently about how we make sure there's an equitable set of outcomes for organizations on the other side, is a real issue as well. How that's going to play out, I don't know, but I'll turn it back to you guys to say whatever it is you want to say.
Jeff, do you want to weigh in here, please?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think Susan said it well. What we're hearing the same thing. Funders are a couple of different things. One, funders are particularly focused on their set of grantees that they've had existing relationships with. They're asking them to what they need, being responsive to what they need. There's been a lot of opening up into unrestricted general operating as opposed to program or grants that had restrictions. A lot of that is being lifted. There's definitely a fair number of funders that realize that this pandemic has only exacerbated the inequities in our society and really brought them to the forefront. And if you open up a newspaper and read who the communities are that are the most affected, you can see we're talking primarily about people that are people of color in urban communities where it's the working class, people who are on the front lines. And so the funders that are thinking about ways to address that are turning to those communities and figuring out how they can support those communities, probably even if they weren't in their portfolio. So where funders are going out beyond their usual portfolio is to look at those inequities and where they can support them. So if your organization is working with communities that fall within those parameters, you have perhaps, we have yet to see how that's going to play out, as Susan said, but there may be some opportunity there. And again, much of the sector is still in emergency response. So funders now are some of them are turning their attention to the next phase. but we're also being clear to funders from our point of view that we're still in this, there are still many organizations and people in that emergency phase, and so not to completely segue into the next phase without continuing to think about the current phase that we're in.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah,
Perfect. We have another question about digital programming. There have been recent studies that audiences are getting tired of digital programming since it peaked in March. Do you still think this is an effective way to reach audiences?
So I have a bet with some of my museum friends about this. You know, if we ever wanted to know whether or not digital programming is worth it, we're going to find out right now. Everybody's, you know, that there's every side of the argument that we've been having for the last 10 years, we're going to find out right now. I would say there's a couple things going on right now in the, around research that I would point people to. There are studies happening right now in real time that are going to happen, could be pushed out at the end of June, July. I know, Catherine, you know about them too, through Wolf Brown and through Slover Lynette Culture Track. Both of them are testing on the digital response and about how people feel about the digital wall. And so these are large market random-based studies. They're good, thoughtful, statistically relevant studies around the country to actually look by discipline and region to see what people's attitudes are. I know those results are going to be shared broadly. I would suggest everybody keep watch for those and other studies as they come up. I think they're going to test that very issue. I also think, to someone's point, there are some folks, the point that you made, there are some folks that have said they've seen a diminishment of digital, and other folks have seen an increase. You know, there's a big discussion about what it is you're putting up. You know, the archival footage, the blah, blah, blah gets old pretty fast. We are watching some theaters nationally who have taken to actually creating art, commissioning art for the digital moment and for the actual moment of now. That art seems to be getting more of an uptake than I'm showing you the lectures from the last 4 years. Or the streaming of whatever, the one camera stream of my performance that kind of looks shady and isn't that fabulous. So I think this idea of quality, vigor, relevance, programming is the same on digital as it is on what you put on your own floors, right? There's no real difference. People want quality, high quality work than when they were stuck. So I think that's just different.
It's the differentiation and why you would do it, right? Success is in some ways individually determined by what programming you're putting out and what response you hope to see. So I think in some ways unsurprising that the strategy to sort of flood the market with creative stuff in the beginning is growing old, but as people modulate to the real quality, the products that are more thoughtfully, they weren't thoughtful in the first place, but the products that are about responding to the need in the moment right now, for different sets of reasons, we'll see how those play over time.
And the last thing, I know we're running out of time, but the last thing I would say about digital, I think that everybody needs to think about is a lot of it went out free. Artists weren't compensated. That's not good. I don't know how else to put that, but that's not good. You know, how do we create a sense of value when we're pushing out digital free? When the artist, and how do we make sure the artists themselves or the art gets paid? There's real issues under there that really need to be thought through.
Thank you, Susan and Bailey. Thanks, Kelvin, for managing our questions. I have a lot of questions coming in. That was great. As next steps, we will, with today's Wednesday, so if not this week, then very early next week, you'll get a follow-up email from my colleague, Catherine Cook. It will have the presentation slides. All of the links that we've been sharing in the chat, we'll share again, including the links to more information about these studies that Susan talked about, some examples if we can, get together with, Susan mentioned sharing an example or two, but it will be a full email, so look for that. It'll be good follow-up. And really, I just want to thank so much the Barr Foundation for working with us and TDC to make this happen for so many nonprofits today. We really appreciate that. and Catherine for being on the line from Arts Boston. This was a good partnership, and we were happy to do that with you and are grateful. So thanks everyone for staying on the line for this digital experience. No creative art, but some good open thinking. Thanks everyone so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye.